Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome. I am Jack Eit. On today's show, Western culture, Middle Eastern cosmology, and reclaiming the wild landscape of spirituality. Host Carrie Kim will be interviewing Neil Douglas-Klotz, writer, researcher, teacher, and musician in the field of Near East or Southwest Asian spirituality. Neil Douglas-Klotz, Ph.D., is a renowned author working on the translation and interpretation of the ancient Semitic languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. Living in Scotland, he was for many years the co-chair of the mysticism group of the American Academy of Religion, a frequent speaker and workshop leader. He is author of several books on the Aramaic spirituality of Jesus, including Prayers of the Cosmos and Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus, as well as books on native Middle Eastern spirituality and Sufism.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, we are grateful to have renowned writer, researcher, teacher, and musician Neil Douglas-Klotz joining us today, particularly to reclaim the wild landscape of our spiritual life versus the monocrop field of organized religion and toxic theology that has historically divorced many of us from nature and forcibly imposed monotheism upon our ancestors and many indigenous peoples worldwide. Neil will help us deepen our understanding about how society has evolved in the West due to cultural and spiritual extraction from the East. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their enduring presence, legacy, and continued leadership as our show comes to you from the ancestral, unceded homelands of the Tongva and all of their relatives. We encourage listeners to align and act with the many Native nations of the places where you now live. May we act in solidarity with local indigenous peoples and do our best to ensure that their cultural heritage and lifeways remain for many generations to come. For the past 2,000 years, the West has extracted, refined, and harnessed the spiritual resources of the Middle East to create and fuel modern culture. Organized religion, air quotes, is a relatively new innovation in human affairs, perhaps only 2,000 or 3,000 years old. For at least 10 or 20 times as long, humans participated in a more open-ended, nomadic spirituality, one that embraced healing, ritual, art, poetry, drama, dance, and chant to make sense of their existence. Unwilling to look at its own Western religious roots in terms of an indigenous spirituality. Western culture has denied both body and the earth. Whether we're aware of it or not, we are all influenced by Western culture's distorted version of Middle Eastern cosmology, psychology, and spirituality. Neil Douglas-Klotz joins us today to reclaim the wild landscape of spirituality and the original, loving, and interdependent existence of our inheritance, where all life is sacred. This intro was excerpted from your own book, Neil. You may not even remember it, Desert Wisdom, A Nomad's Guide to Life's Big Questions from the Heart of the Native Middle East. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for having me.
We are so grateful to have you on the show to ponder how we might restore this wildness and return to the earth and breath as source.
Well, there's only a few things I would change in what I wrote in 1995 when I originally wrote that.
Yes.
One is that, we have to stretch the 10 to 20,000 years back much, much further from what we now know. The other is that, of course, the whole term Middle East is somewhat based on a place that is between East and West, which is itself, of course, not true. It's its own place. Right. So some people choose now to call it Southwest Asia, and I often do until people don't realize what I'm talking about. But say Middle East, Near East, all, but not to quibble about terms, but we know. So today I would change that actually.
Well, that's good
The
to know.
rest I would stand by. I would say, there still is this denial of the fact that you could say the Middle Eastern traditions have a native tradition before they were colonized by a
Right.
type of organized religion.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually this is much relatively later than we thought, or
Mm-hmm.
even that I thought when I wrote this, gosh, however long ago that was. That's going on 30 years or so now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder if you could begin, for those listeners who are not yet familiar with you, a little backstory of your own origins, how you embarked on this journey of ancient Semitic languages and native traditions of Southwest Asia. I wonder, you had mentioned your family was influenced by the work of Rachel Carson, and that you were also an investigative journalist in NYC back in the day.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I grew up, in the 50s in a type of alternative family,
Mm-hmm.
really. And I'll say we had an inner culture and an outer culture. In my family, the inner culture was holistic health, as it's now called, because my father was one of the early chiropractors in Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
They were also, as you mentioned, into Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and the whole early ecological, you could say, organic farming and gardening movement. And then they were also into Edgar Cayce, who was an early American channel of
Mm-hmm.
holistic remedies and other things like that. So, I mean, in my family culture, we were taught, that when the DDT trucks came into the neighborhood, you run home and close all the windows. Whereas, in the 50s, when I was growing up, or the say the late 50s, early 60s, all the children were playing in the DDT, in the street. It's like, wow, fun, So we had this whole thing going on.
Uh-huh.
But because my father worked in a small town in Illinois, we were sent to a rather conservative Christian elementary school where I was compelled to learn the large parts of the Bible by heart and
Uh-huh.
Luther's Small Catechism by heart and all sorts of things, which were very good for memory training, but are very confusing to the child mind because they talk about original sin and all this stuff, which actually isn't in the Bible at all,
Mhm.
and how humans are supposed to dominate over nature. And again, that's a mistranslation of what's actually in the Bible, as I found out later.
Mhm.
But so we had sort of inner outer family culture going on, and that probably predisposed me to want to find out things, which is
Right.
why I became an investigative journalist in New
Mhm.
York City. And my main field was actually ecology, because
Mhm.
there was an early ecological movement when I graduated from university in 1973.
Mhm.
And also the food and drugs, what they're putting in our food and drugs. So I had sources in the Food and Drug Administration, things like that. And this was way before the internet was a thing. So you
Sure.
actually had to interview people, do research, and
Mhm.
couldn't just make stuff up and pontificate about it. So,
Mhm.
but anyway, so that was my background, basically.
Well, that early education and in school and all that kind of maybe to you as a child, it felt like some kind of an indoctrination learning that. And I mean, I don't know if you found that even as a child, maybe you felt oppressed by that. I think you had said something in your heart felt that this wasn't quite true. Yeah.
Clearly, I didn't feel it was true. And, thanks God or thanks Goddess, when I came home, my family wasn't all that fussed about religion. I mean,
Hmm.
they were into, Casey and Carson and chiropractic. And, that was what that was what was going on in my family.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
all this other stuff, they said, just,
Well,
so
you had
I couldn't take it that seriously.
Well, you had described your parents as that free thinking Christians, which almost feels like an oxymoron, I think, for some.
It
But
does these days, yeah, but in those days,
yeah.
there were still people of that type, actually.
Mhm. Well, tapping into your investigative journalistic background, what did being an investigative journalist back in that time teach you, and how is that applicable to your life today? Seeing the capture of journalism, legacy media, corporate influences, and big pharma. I mean, are you encouraged by the rise of independent media as a counterbalance? What has changed from then to now?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, yes, there is independent media, but the proliferation of independent media on the internet doesn't necessarily mean that people are actually doing any research at all
Right.
into
Or that
actually
they're.
what is going on.
Mhm.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I
Right.
mean, when I was in New York City and I was working for well, ostensibly a consumer protection publication,
Mhm.
as it was called, I was doing stories and finding out things, and I went to the publisher called me in, and I was, young guy. I was like 19 or 20 or something. And
Uh-huh.
the publisher says to me, Neil, you're doing really good work, but you have to make people more afraid. Make them
Oh.
fear. Because if they're afraid, they'll buy our magazine, they'll buy our publication. And I
Hmm.
thought, hmm. So I quit that job
Right.
and I went to work for an alternative news service in Denver, Colorado in
Mm-hmm.
the mid 1970s. And there were such things then. There were actually several of them. And
Right.
we syndicated to about 400 or 500 independent, sometimes they were called underground newspapers, college university newspapers, things like that. And it was all done by mail. We didn't have a lot of machinery.
Mm-hmm.
So we syndicated stories twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
And in your mid 20s, I felt, I'm doing what I need to do. I'm informing people about what is actually going on in the environment, in their food, in their drugs. Others of my colleagues were on other topics like the Vietnam War, stuff like that. But then I ran into a survey that made it very clear to me that people don't make decisions based on facts. They
Mm-hmm.
make decisions based on something else.
Right.
And this is still the case today, you could
Of
say.
course.
Those sorts of things don't change. And at this point, I had a major depression and went on my own, you could say, inner search to try to
Mm-hmm.
figure out, okay, how do I really make decisions in my life? Do I have all the facts before I make a major life decision?
Mm-hmm.
And I had to answer, well, no, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what sort of put me into this other realm where went on you could say, a spiritual or psycho-spiritual search for myself and ended up looking into different, you could say, ways to calm my mind.
Well, were you feeling a mistrust about the world at that point? I mean, it's really kind of nothing's really changed in that sense as far as the corruption in the world, the greed that we see. I mean, we're at kind of an apex of that right now. So,
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. No, I mean, there was a mistrust of the world, but also there was a sense that, maybe I could be doing something better to change things,
hmm
to
hmm
affect things,
hmm
because what I was doing didn't seem to be doing any, didn't wasn't really doing anything. I ended up by a long circuitous route with basically what I'm doing now, which is dealing with the spirituality of the ancient, you could say, nomadic cultures in the Middle East through their language and
hmm
deciphering some of that. So it was a very circuitous sort of way. I always ended up working in publishing one way or another. I
Well,
can I
and
can tell you more about that
you
anyway.
continue to be a writer. I was wondering if you could share more about this, the early running from Jesus in your youth, and how you rediscovered Jesus through this deep study of the hermeneutics of Aramaic and indigenous Middle Eastern traditions. Listeners may have had similar experiences of running from Jesus, given religious fascism, dark histories behind Christianity and organized religion. And if you could kind of weave through some of that, your own journey.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to weed through. I mean, there's actually no end of weeding that could be done. I had this sense in childhood because of the way I was raised that there was more than what the church was telling us to who
Hmm.
this fellow Jesus, or as I discovered later,
Right.
his Aramaic name, Yeshua, was really
Yeah.
all about. And I
Hmm.
searched into various traditions, yoga and this and that and the other things. And I eventually ended up with the Sufis on the West Coast
Right.
of the US. And because I had a publishing background, they put me in charge of editing the
Mhm.
diaries and letters of one of their teachers.
Right.
And in those diaries and letters, I found the statement that the two things this fellow wanted to do, this fellow whose name was Samuel L. Lewis,
Hmm.
one was he wanted to start this thing called Dances of Universal Peace to help people, make peace when they're at war and eat, dance, and pray together and all that. And the
Hmm.
second thing was he wanted to learn how to pray the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic, as he called it. And because the Sufis are into sound and what you would call in the Eastern traditions mantra, I felt,
Hmm.
well, this must be something. This must be like Jesus's mantric language.
Uh-huh.
So I wanted to find out what's going on with this and see what's there. I mean,
Hmm.
now I know that you can't translate any native Middle Eastern word as Lord. So the Lord is a medieval overlay on, we yet one of the thousands of medieval overlays onto Christianity. So
It's amazing. It's a troubling world word, but you still hear it today. And I don't think anyone
yeah,
even questions it. That's what's remarkable to me. But
No, I know. So I just call it the prayer of Jesus, or the prayer of Yeshua, really. So I began to, investigate this sort of both ways in my feeling, chanting the words, and then also in the language. And I started to have very deep experiences with this.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
And then I
just
went to
that
work.
alone, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to make a long story short, I went, about really 3, 4 years later, I went to
Mm-hmm.
work for Matthew Fox, who some of
Yes.
folks will hear about for sure, because he's been blogging a lot recently
Mm-hmm.
about what's going on. And I went to work for him, and he said, Neil, this is wonderful, but you need to find out more. You need to learn Aramaic better, write a book about it, and on and on. And that's what started me on all this. So,
In which you went on to do. And we're so thankful for you being out there in the world doing that because honestly, like I said, I have my own run from Jesus as well into spirituality.
absolutely.
I mean, many people would say that. They would say I'm spiritual, but not religious. They would, really
Yeah.
that's not what they want. But at the same time, culturally, societally, everything that's going on in the world, we do need to return to our spiritual life, embrace spiritual life, because it feels like that's really the key piece that's missing for many of us.
Yeah, I mean, like as Einstein says, you can't solve problems from the same consciousness that created them. And for your listeners, I'm talking about Jesus before Christianity. There was a guy before he got
Yes.
colonized as what we today call Christianity.
Mhm.
And this is the important feature.
Well, even if you can talk about the terms, and, there's this tendency to label everything, even like saying Christianity, these words. I don't
Yeah.
really feel that that's part of the original teachings. But if you could talk about what you feel that listeners should know about Jesus, you talk about him as the most projected upon human being of the world, and divine and
Well,
human. But it's important to understand this.
yeah, in Western culture, this is certainly true.
Yes.
He was mined, or you could say, just like any other charismatic shamanic figure, to
Hmm.
create this religion that, due to the twisting not only of his words, but the twisting and the mistranslation of many of the words of the Bible, literal mistranslation, leads to the justification for colonialism, racism, misogyny. You can go on and on about what you can
Hmm.
lay at the doorstep of this.
Hmm.
And people say, well, it's just mistranslation. But it's more than that. I mean, this was these are the footnotes, these are the underpinnings of a lot of what happens in the early Christian era.
Yeah, one of my mentors even talks about, well, look at the how we say the date. We do say 2024, which just kind of goes to show that we still are in that framework, how
We're in
much.
that framework, yeah, the so-called time since Jesus, or
Mhm.
theoretically since Jesus, really.
Yeah, I
But
mean, you've talked about that, the agendas of power, politics, empire, patriarchy. It's still what goes on today. Could you draw some parallels between society during Jesus's time and this consolidation of power, corruption, corporate greed, the racism and ecocide that we are witnessing today? It is a deja vu. It isn't gone away. This is history repeating itself.
it is, yeah. I mean, and he lived at a time when the Roman Empire was sitting on everyone in that particular area.
Yeah.
And, there were, talk about the elites, there was even a smaller percentage of super rich in his time. And the large, huge, most people were homeless, were underclass. They had been taxed off of their land if they had had land at all.
Right.
Their sons and daughters were put into slavery and all of this. So he's living at a very, very bleak time of
Hmm.
not only the Roman Empire, but then their puppets that they put in charge of various areas in that
Right.
region.
Right. And even the leaders, the Pharisees, I mean, a lot of people are not even familiar with that amount of the corruption that was going on at those levels.
Yeah, I mean, and the Pharisees weren't the worst, actually. The Pharisees were like I mean, literally, we use the word Pharisee now to mean a hypocrite, but the Pharisees were like the liberals who wanted to just sort of adjust the system so that it
Hmm.
would sort of work. Whereas the
Hmm.
Sadducees were the ones that were sort of sitting on everyone at the Romans' behest so that people kept quiet and just
Right.
obeyed.
So we'll be right back, listeners. We're going to take a break now with Neil Douglas-Klotz, and we'll be right back to talk more about native spirituality of the Middle East and the Aramaic Jesus.
You are listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org or socal350.org. For For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/EcoJustice Radio. Today, you're listening to Western Culture, Middle Eastern Cosmology, Reclaiming the Wild Landscape of Spirituality, with host Carrie Kim and guest Neil Douglas-Klotz, writer, researcher, teacher, and musician in the field of Near East or Southwest Asian spirituality.
So, Neil, we are back talking about the parallels between Jesus's time and the time of today, and all of the things that we witnessed as far as the ills of modern life, the ills of modern society, and different things that we are witnessing this tumultuous Anthropocene time. What do you feel is the relevance of Jesus's original teachings today, and how can they be applied in a way to reconnect us to nature, reconnect us to care for each other, and restoring our compassion also for one another?
Well, gosh, where to start, Carrie?
And just cram it all in into 1 hour. Yeah.
There's so much to unravel, and this is what I end up doing for most of the groups I
I
speak
know.
to before they can get to it. I mean, I'll do a bit of that. I
Okay.
mean, if you look at his language, and you look at actually even what's in the Gospels,
Mhm.
Jesus never asks anyone to save their soul. He says you want to realize what your soul is, which is the bigger part that is beyond the you, beyond the individual self, and
Right.
let your soul save you. So
Mhm.
we are, for Yeshua, part of a
Mhm.
much, much bigger, you could say, reality. We're part
Yes.
of a humanity that connects all over the planet,
Mhm.
a humanness, you can say.
Mhm.
And this humanness is itself, I'm giving you a bit of metaphysics here.
Right. Yes.
This
Yes.
humanness is a sense, you could say, a downloading of reality
Mhm.
into these bodies. Now, our job description here, our mission statement, according to Genesis, is that we're supposed to realize first that there were a whole bunch of other creatures created ahead of us, using the words of creation. And second, that we're supposed to learn to manage our individuality. Humans should manage their individuality so that they realize they're supposed to, you could say, manage their individuality along with all of the other natural beings that were created ahead of us. In other words, they're supposed to live within their ecology and not dominate and subdue it, which are egregious mistranslations of the words of Genesis,
Mhm.
where it's usually translated dominate and subdue all these creatures and rule over them and on and on. And,
Right.
and this, I talked to even other Hebrew scholars about this, and they say, well, we didn't want to correct it because that's the way the Christians were translating it, even though it's wrong. There's so much that can be laid at the doorstep of such mistranslations. The so-called doctrine of dominating and subduing the earth was used to justify, moving native peoples off their land because they're not dominating and subduing the earth. So
Right.
they're not really there, which is
That's
the way
like
it
the
was put in
mandate.
Australia in the
Mhm.
native, the Aboriginals. So
Mhm.
there's no one there. They're really not there. So this stuff becomes the fuel, again, back to that metaphor, for a trajectory, a journey of the human self that becomes, as we see it today in the West at least, more and more individualistic, more and more materialistic. And between those two, I would call it the selfishness and and the materialism, we've painted ourselves into a corner as a human species.
Right.
So the good news is that there is still something within us that remembers those ancient times. And this is true wherever you are, from whatever culture you come, at some point your ancestors were nomadic
Right.
and they were living, traveling all the time. And this
And they were
makes a big
connected to the
difference. This is
land. I mean, yeah.
pre-agricultural, yeah, basically. And
Mhm.
you had to connect to the unseen realm. You had to connect to the ancestors to get a download. You could say, get messages about where to go next.
Mhm.
Yes, you could follow where they had gone, but
Right.
sometimes, the food that you expected to find there wasn't there. So you had to
Mhm.
consult in the inner realm, the stars, consult the ancestors, all these things. This is common throughout the whole of the world, it
Mhm.
seems. And it was certainly true in Southwest Asia.
Mhm.
So the doors between the world have to open again. This is
Mhm.
why people are turning to spirituality. To realize, there's more than just the individual self, the individual I. There's
Right.
more than just me. You
And
know,
more
th
than the material world, how you said that here we materialize concepts. We also, some people believe just that the I, more like the ego I in the material world, are the only things that exist.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Freud contributes to this to some degree
Hmm.
because he takes the Jewish Kabbalistic, the Jewish mystical notion of three parts of the self, and he compresses it all to be within the individual human being.
Mm-hmm.
So Freud's id, ego, and superego, I don't know if people are familiar with this, but
Sure.
the id is like the untamed wild
Right.
self that you have to sit
Mm-hmm.
on, and the
Mm-hmm.
ego is like the conscious self, the conscious, and the superego is like your conscience, which
Mm-hmm.
has all your moral laws downloaded. So you have to, keep to all these rules. So you keep the wild part of you, suppressed down. I mean, there's an
Mm-hmm.
anti-ecological model right there. But in Jewish mysticism, it talks about, okay, there's a part of us which is
Mm-hmm.
still unknown, which is still becoming known. This is like because the dark part of a candle's flame,
Mm-hmm.
and we're gradually consuming these bodies. As we go along, we're giving some sense of light, which is the visible light, but then above the visible light, there is a shimmering sort of, which you can sometimes see in a candle very
Mm-hmm.
easily. You can see if you look through a candle flame toward the beginning, you see this shimmering, and they say, well, we're really this shimmering part, which is all around us. We're all of them, but if we forget that we're part of it, then we're wasting the time that we have
Mm-hmm.
with just this what seems to be apparent, or which calls some people call the phenomena around us, rather
Mm-hmm.
than connecting. And then once we connect to this bigger sense of ourself, as Jung would call it, the capital S self, then we will know what to do, what is ours to do. We can see clearly, we can hear clearly, we can sense clearly, and we will have a very firm sense of what is mine to do, not what is everyone else's to do, but we can choose. And this is the gift of the individuality that we now have,
Right.
that
Yeah.
we can choose. On
Mm-hmm.
the good side, of course, there is much more of an understanding of human rights,
Mm-hmm.
individual human rights, than there was in the ancient world. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't an issue in the ancient world. You were living survival,
Right.
basically.
Exactly.
I mean, a
Like you
lot of
said,
people still
people
live
did that.
survival, but
Right.
the human rights are not an issue if you're living
Mm-hmm.
mouth to
Subsistence.
mouth. It's
Right.
it's not an
Exactly.
issue.
Sure.
But
Sure.
now, of course, people have more of a sense of this, and so
Mm-hmm.
this has, in a positive sense, come into our culture.
Mm-hmm.
But, we need to reclaim, what we left behind and let what we do now be informed by that bigger sense of our humanity, bigger sense of heart, bigger sense of, you could say, of who we really are.
And our interdependence, I think that's a really key point. I mean, you've often talked about sort of the narcissistic tendency of our time, and that's sort of celebrated and actually pursued
Yeah.
and uplifted as, DIY, that's the way to go. And it's not connected with community and helping each other and, truly like loving each other as our neighbors. And so that's all so critically important to our times in an Anthropocene time and
Yeah.
reconnecting to all of life. I wonder if you could speak more about this concept of original sin, which have you've said it doesn't actually exist in Aramaic, but there's so much of that, the saving, the original sin, the Garden of Eden, the transgression of Eve. If you could a little bit debunk some of that so people understand this is not what the original teachings were saying. It's
Happy to
incredible.
do it. I mean, again, original sin comes from a fellow by the name of Augustine of Hippo, who was later made a saint in the early church. And depending on who you read about his life, he came from a very dualistic, different tradition, not Christianity. And so
Mm-hmm.
he had this whole idea of light versus darkness and good versus evil. And it's a very polarized idea of these things. I'm not
Okay.
saying that there isn't evil and there isn't goodness, but it's
Right.
less polarized. It's not like a strict dividing line.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But St. Augustine was from this, and very interestingly enough, he came up with this idea of original sin because all of a sudden Constantine was converted to Christianity
Mm.
sometime in about the 300s or so. And
Okay.
so then the Roman Empire becomes Christian, but life didn't get better.
Right.
So St. Augustine, according to my reading of his life story, he fell into a deep depression and he
Mm-hmm.
thought, well, there must be something wrong at the very beginning of creation.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
this is this original sin, and they lay it on Eve because of the apple, except there's actually no apple mentioned. This is all stuff that was so he,
Fabricated.
no, no, it's true. There are two separate stories, and I don't want to bore your listeners with this, but because many of us were raised with this, there are two separate wisdom stories in Genesis about creation. They are
Hmm.
not meant to be read sequentially, one after the other. The first story is a 7-day story, but
Okay.
they're not 24-hour days. They are 24 sort of periods, emanations.
Hmm.
They're not our years, they're not our days.
Right.
So over eons, these things happen. Then finally, at the end of that story, or toward the end, the human
Hmm.
is created. I'm
Hmm.
using the word created loosely. But yes,
Okay.
the human, here we have the human. After eons of, you could say,
Right.
experimentation, we have the human. And the human is created male and female.
Right.
One human being created male and female. This was
Ah,
the early
yeah.
notion.
Hmm.
So the human being has both,
Both
every
yin and
human being
yang.
already has both
Yeah.
within them,
Hmm.
and they express gradations of it outside. So that story completes with this idea, of a day of rest. Yes,
Hmm.
have a day of rest so you're not active all the time, and then use that day to turn within and
Hmm.
remember where you came from. This is what the Holy One does, as the
Hmm.
end of the Genesis 1 story describes it. The Holy One doesn't take a nap, it turns within, and this is what human beings are supposed to do, turn within, remember that I wasn't here before my birth, and I won't be here in this body after my death, but
Hmm.
I do come from a living place, and I'm going to a living place,
Hmm.
an unseen realm.
Hmm.
So that's
Hmm.
how that story ends. The second story is this Adam, Eve, and the snake story. And again, different words are used for male and female than is used in the first story.
Hmm.
So it's very clear from the Hebrew that what we're talking about, again, is not a man and a woman. We're talking about a type of consciousness, two different aspects in our consciousness,
Right.
a more creative and a more, how shall we say, conservative part of our consciousness. And what is offered is the idea, well, would you like to know good from evil? This is the
Mm-hmm.
tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
So the human being in this story form, in this mythic form, is offered the possibility of having a preference. Do you like this? Do
Mm-hmm.
you not like this? Do you like, because before then, the preferences, who
Right.
had a preference? No one had a preference. No,
Right.
in archaic consciousness, no one has preferences,
Hmm.
really. I mean, you
Right.
had a preference to have food, but everybody had food, so it wasn't
Hmm.
that there was scarcity. There was no
Right.
scarcity in that
Hmm.
sense. So a human being is offered, you could say, would you like to know good from evil? Okay, well, eat this fruit. Well, the fruit is symbolical of, you could say, of circling around ourself, which is what the
Hmm.
snake, the wisdom snake symbolizes. So you become more individual. You become more
Hmm.
individual, which offers freedom, which offers choice, which offers the ability to have preferences,
And to
all that
experience
stuff,
the
which is
world.
wonderful.
Right.
And that's the way the ancients told this story. So we
Mm.
have a self at a certain point. Perhaps this itself takes eons. Before then, we didn't have an individual self, really. We didn't even have a sense that we were part of a tribe. We were just part of
All that is.
all that is. And one person put this as though we were living with wearing nature as our outer clothing.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
It wasn't just that we had feelings for it,
Right.
it was part of us.
Not
And
separate.
it was also what filled our inner life. So we didn't have a separate subconscious life, a separate dream life, all this. It was all like the ancient Aboriginals talk about in Australia, that it was like a dream time,
Well,
basically.
what's amazing in speaking with you and learning from you about all of the original teachings and the Aramaic versions of it is that it is so much far more expansive and cosmic than I could ever have imagined because it's not the way it's propagated. It's not the way it's taught to many of us. It's
Not at
so
all.
and limited and it's completely distorted by man. And man, I also mean in the patriarchal sense too, because of all of the
Yes,
negation of feminine aspects, even if we're not talking about a woman, but the feminine aspects of our consciousness. So I
absolutely,
wonder,
because it all became much more one-sided.
mhm, mhm.
And yeah,
Uh, so what do you feel? Do you feel that more people are reclaiming and returning to trying to find more of the source teachings? Because we know that it's this grand distortion and it's still being propagated today. And I don't know if people kind of have a fixed notion of it and they're just holding on to it, but it's not actually true when you actually go to the source. But
no,
I
it's
don't
not
think
true at
you're willing
all.
to do that. You have to be willing to kind of let go of everything you've ever learned.
Well, I mean,
Some
Carrie, I
people.
can tell you, I've been doing I've been doing this since, let's call it the early 1980s.
Uh-huh.
So where I'm going on 45 years now. And yes, there has been more people are hearing it. More people are at least shedding these chains with which they've been burdened in their childhood, which is
Yeah.
about guilt and shame and, you know,
Disempowerment.
this
I
and
mean,
all that. So,
mhm.
so this is happening. Other people, of course, for reasons that you mentioned at the beginning, they just equate Jesus with Christianity and they just say, well, I don't want any of this stuff. Just
Right.
get rid of it all. But
Uh-huh.
some sense of spirituality has to be reclaimed.
Sure.
And as Jung said, Carl Jung, Western humanity has to reclaim where it came from. That is
Mhm.
what helped create Western culture, if we can use
Mhm.
loosely the word culture, and unravel and reclaim, what the authenticity of that is, not Christianity, but,
Right.
its spiritual roots. And this comes from
Mhm.
the shamanic spirituality of Greece. This is before Plato and
Mhm.
Socrates,
Mhm.
as my
Which you
friend
never
Peter
really hear
Kingsley
about.
writes about. And then,
Yeah.
the ancient Southwest Asia, the so-called Middle East.
I mean, what would you like to say about speaking, diverging from that topic a little bit, but we're on it, is what would you like to say to indigenous communities, given all the subjugation, the intergenerational traumas inflicted upon them through boarding schools, missionization, and also all from a distortion, as you've said already,
Yes.
how this was used, how the teachings were used, the distorted teachings were used to subjugate people and impose
Keeps
upon them control and mhm.
I can only encourage them to keep struggling. Hopefully, eventually, human consciousness will change. Because otherwise, as I said earlier, we've painted ourselves into a corner in so-called Western culture or modern culture, since it's spread all over the planet at this point. I do see cracks in it, however, in various places, not just from my work, because I'm just sitting in one little
Right.
aspect of it, but in many people's work.
Right. Kind of that would happen exponentially, this change, because it's happening in many different pockets. Because as you said, talking about like ancient Greek shamanism, or there, when you go through, when you see it through an Aramaic lens, and I only know very little, but it appears that Jesus is much more as a yogi, a mystic, a shaman, both divine and human. The apostles could be considered yogis. It's very different than the way we see this, by the way it's propagated in the West. And Jesus protested against the religious hierarchies and the doctrines and the power structures of his time. So, I feel like it's like Jesus was the original spiritualist and activist.
He was. I mean, in both of those senses, now we only have words like yogi, shaman, Taoist master, but Jesus was his own person too. And he says in the Gospel of John, since I can quote all this stuff, he says, those who come after me will do the things that I have done and greater. And this
Hmm.
is what a large part of mainstream Christianity ignores. They just want us to put Jesus on an altar and worship him rather than to
Right.
try to attain the states that he attained and
Hmm.
become what he became. The problem is that, scholars haven't done much better. I
Hmm.
worked in the scholarly world for many years, and they've also colonized Jesus or Yeshua in their own ways to sort
Right.
of make him sort of safe and
Mm-hmm.
in the most extreme part of the scholarship on Jesus, he didn't even exist.
Hmm.
Why? Because he said different things at different times, and different people remember different things. I mean,
Sure.
there's a native teacher for you. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm seriously.
Yes. Yes.
This is part of this so-called historical Jesus movement, which basically ends up saying, well, maybe there was never a Jesus.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, Neil, we're going to take a break right here. We'll be right back to talk more about Aramaic Jesus and your scholarly work and also your spiritual work.
You are listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org or socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today, you're listening to Western Culture, Middle Eastern Cosmology, Reclaiming the Wild Landscape of Spirituality, with host Carrie Kim and guest Neil Douglas-Klotz, writer, researcher, teacher, and musician in the field of Near East or Southwest Asian spirituality.
So, Neil, in continuing, I'm wondering if you could address a bit more about the repression of feminine aspects of wisdom in religion and the Bible. And also, if you could speak a little bit maybe about the Sophia principle. Some people may never have even heard this. I had never even heard this word till recently. But if you could speak about that, this feminine expression and sacred wisdom of quote unquote
Yeah,
God.
thanks, Carrie. Some of my favorite things that people ask about this, and rightly so. Okay, let's get nitty-gritty on this. Looking at
Okay.
Yeshua's words as they're reported in the Gospels, even in the Gospels that made the cut and made it into the Bible.
All right.
There were hundreds of ones that didn't make it in, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, all this stuff. But even in the ones that are there,
Mhm.
if he said anything, he said it in Aramaic. Okay,
Mhm.
let's agree on that. I
Yes.
get scholars to agree on this thing. If or when he said anything, he said it in Aramaic, all right?
Right. Right.
Okay, so then if you look at the Aramaic words, anything that could have been translated feminine
Hmm.
was translated neuter.
Okay.
Anything that could have been translated, and this is true in Greek too, because most of the translations come from Greek.
Hmm.
Anything that could be translated neuter was translated masculine. These are
Okay.
different genders of words. And
Right.
anything that was masculine gendered was, of course, translated masculine.
Right.
A key example of this is the word for kingdom, where
Yes.
it says in his prayer, Tete mal kutach, which is translated, Thy kingdom come. Well,
Hmm.
both the Aramaic and the Greek words that are translated kingdom here are
Hmm.
actually feminine gendered.
Right.
So it should have been minimally queendom,
And
although I
even
would
that is a
maintain
limit,
that's
right?
still feudalistic.
Right. Sure. The word. I mean, why do we keep, holding on to these words that are so inaccurate, really, to the
Yeah.
greater understanding and the expansiveness of it all?
And this goes on throughout his words. A lot of the words for different words for the soul or for the individual self, these are feminine gendered too.
Mm,
Because there was at his time quite an active tradition of Hakima, which
hmm.
is the Aramaic version of Sophia, which is Greek, which means that people felt at his time, at the time of Jesus, at the time of Yeshua,
Right.
that some feminine figure would come again and bring everyone together and make
Mhm.
sure everyone had enough to eat.
Mm,
And this was the archetype, if you want to use the word archetype, that's presented of Chokhmah. This is her Hebrew name in the book
mhm,
of Proverbs. That you could say that everyone will be invited to a common table. There will be enough to eat and drink for all, and the injustices that we've suffered will be lifted. And this was
mhm,
from even 100 or so years before the time of Jesus.
mm,
And so the fact that this guy came along
mhm,
and he was in a male body didn't bother people. Because if
mhm.
you remember, we all have male, female within us. People still
Right.
had this idea, had this
Sure.
notion. Okay, so he's got a male body this time, and next time he'll have a female body, and
Right.
so there wasn't anything like that. So many early people who followed Yeshua felt he was an embodiment of Sophia, or as they would
Mm,
call it in Aramaic, Hakima, holy
mhm,
wisdom, and
mhm,
would be this wisdom figure to bring everyone together. So
mhm.
that's on the outer level. On the
Right.
inner level, what Yeshua teaches is that you have to find this inner Sophia, the inner Hakima within
Mm,
yourself. And
mhm,
this involves a practice, and this is true also in the ancient Greek culture, of bringing all your senses together
mhm,
and to realize that, for instance, we don't see with our eyes, we see through our eyes.
mhm,
We don't hear with our ears, we hear through our ears. These physical vehicles that are our senses, something else is smelling, touching, tasting, feeling
mhm,
through us.
mhm,
And this is the Chokhmah or the Sophia consciousness. So this
mhm,
is another way back to the same place I mentioned early on, that we come to this place where we're all basically together in consciousness, human consciousness.
mhm, mhm,
Something is knowing through us, if you will. This is the
mhm.
inner side of this wisdom or Chokhmah consciousness in the Gospel of, I think it's Mark. I should know this. But anyway,
Well,
again,
it's truly remarkable though, because the translations of Aramaic Jesus are radically different than what comes through in the King James Bible, and
they are.
Aramaic translations remind me much more of yogic, Vedic teachings, Zen, Buddhism, Taoism, indigenous cosmologies. It's radical, and particularly because Jesus often references nature in the teachings. Your thoughts about this and how nature? One of my friends comments on the Bible as an eco fable. It's like the ultimate eco fable. I don't know what your
Yeah.
are about this.
Yeah, I mean, Yeshua says there's this famous parable, not really a parable, it's a simile. He says, a good tree bears good fruit and an evil tree bears evil fruit. The words he's using in Aramaic for good and evil are ripe, R-I-P-E, and unripe.
Mm-hmm.
Tub and Bisha is the
Mm-hmm.
actual Aramaic.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion of evil in those times was something that is not in its right time, not in its right place. It may be too green, it's still growing, or more likely, it's already gone rotten and it needs to go to the compost. And
Right.
this refers to behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
individual, collective behaviors. And Yeshua says, okay, look, a ripe tree is bearing ripe fruit. By the fruit you will know the tree.
Mm-hmm.
Is it doing what it was sent here to do?
Mm-hmm.
Is it in its right time, its right place? Is it in the moment, as we would say? And
Mm-hmm.
or is it, is it bearing unripe fruit, which for one reason or another is only fit to go to the compost?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what he presents in his prayer also. That many of the things he mentions are basically images from nature. And because these words have been made abstract and into theological terms, it all gets sort of, how would we say, reified or, put into some
Mm-hmm.
doctrinal thing that you have to sign up and believe or put your
Right. Well,
put your
yeah,
signature on. And
exactly.
he's not talking about that.
Yeah, it's much more dogmatic and the indoctrination is much stronger. But you've talked about more about this sensorial aspect of moving into this visceral way and then embodied way of understanding these teachings is moving through you. And it's much more, reminds me much more of the Vedas. It's like a dynamic wisdom. It is not
Yes.
fixed. And when you talk about, you have to understand it through the context of the ancient peoples and how they lived their lives versus taking it from a modern sense and trying to go backwards, which isn't really
Yes.
possible.
Yes, and this is what most biblical scholars actually do. They take it from their own sense and they read that sense or that way of knowing, as it's called, which is the academic term. They read a modern epistemology, a way of knowing, back into what ancient peoples were
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the language. I mean, Greek, Aramaic. I mean, I used to think this. But as I say, even the Greek version of the scriptures, Jesus's words, have a much more expansive meaning than what the church sort of sieved out of them and then made
Mhm.
into this fuel for what became.
Right, exactly. I wonder if you could talk about a little bit about the I am the way, the truth, and the life, because it's a bit disturb. I mean, that's a disturbing line to me, actually,
Yeah.
because of the
Oh,
way
yeah.
we interpret the I, and we know that that's not really the way that Jesus had meant it, according to what you've understood. And I wonder if you could break that down in the way it would be in Aramaic, because it's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
it's
happy to
a
do that,
big
Carrie. Thanks
passage.
for asking. Thanks for asking that. I think about a third of my most recent book is devoted to the Gospel of John and all this mistranslation of these so-called I am statements in which
Yeah,
we were taught to see this as Jesus himself speaking of himself. He individually is the way, he individually is the light of the world, and on and on and on.
right.
But what the Aramaic says is that he uses a formula that means I and I, two different words for the same word for I twice. So it's ina ina. He's
Hmm.
actually not saying I am. He's saying connecting your small I to the big I. This
Hmm.
is the way. He's trying to
Right,
show people what to do after he's gone.
right.
Rather than idolize him,
Hmm.
connect your small self to the bigger self of which
Hmm.
you are a part, and then you will know the path. You
Hmm.
will know the way, which way to turn when you come to a crossroads, and you will have the life, which is literally life energy. It's the energy to travel. So you'll
Right.
have what as I
Hmm.
sometimes call it, the road, the GPS, and the energy to
Hmm.
travel.
Hmm.
All that will give you that. And
Right.
all the I am statements so-called I am statements that he offers to his students
Hmm.
are all in this same avenue, different ways in to realize who you really are, your bigger sense of self, not
Hmm.
just your own, you could say, small self individuality.
Hmm.
And as the church made a whole mainstream Christianity made a whole bunch of hay off of this individual
Oh,
stuff. And then
well, I
even where he says after the I am the way, the truth, it says no, it's translated in the King James, no man comes to the Father but by me,
mean,
which is
right.
again a mistranslation because he says, no one comes to the breathing life of all, the mothering, fathering of the cosmos, except traveling the way I'm showing you. I mean,
That's
which is to connect the small self to the big self.
truly
He didn't,
unbelievable.
yeah,
You,
oh, I know.
To
And you can compare ancient traditions, Taoism, the Vedas, all this stuff.
Mhm.
Basically, they're saying somewhat similar.
Yeah, very much so.
Different terms, but basically the same.
Yeah, I mean, it feels
Yeah.
like a great deception, actually, going back
Yeah.
through the Bible and like the King James version and all the distortions. Could you talk about how Christianity has historically suppressed shamanism, paganism, animism, and the belief that living things are our ancestors possessed of spirit and energy, but it seems that actually in the Aramaic that is all possible. It's all things more inclusive, not exclusive. You could be a shaman and love Jesus. It's not exclusive. It's not a mutually exclusive things.
Absolutely. I mean, he's not asking people to believe in him. He never
Mhm.
asked people to believe in him. He says, have the faith that I have, that there's a bigger reality around you from which you come and to which you're returning. That's all he says. He
Mhm.
doesn't say, have faith in me, believe in me, any of this stuff. Doesn't say, I'm going to save you. Doesn't say,
Mhm.
save your soul. None of this. This is all made up later.
Now, I think you were going to say something else before I answered. Asked.
Gosh, I can't remember, but oh yes, uh, yeah, because for Yeshua, this notion of, and this is a big subject because I don't know if we have time about it, but they have a whole different time sense in Aramaic. So it's not just, the past is compartmentalized over here, and we're living
Mhm.
in the present, and the future's over here. It's more like it's unfolding. And the past,
Mm,
our ancestors are traveling ahead of us, like in a
mm,
caravan or a nomadic
mhm,
band, and we're
mhm,
here traveling in the middle, and our children and our children's children are traveling behind us. So
mhm.
we're more concerned about what we leave for our children than we
Right.
are about where we get to.
Mm, mhm,
You know,
mhm.
this is
Right.
where Thomas Berry, the great
Yes.
ecological theologian,
Mhm,
writes about this. He says, we have a dominance of conflicting utopias in the world today. You have, this new world order and that Marxist
mhm,
this and this
mhm.
materialist this and all that. And the Christians have their pie in the sky heaven. And it's all, it's all a balkanized, segmented, whole bunch of different utopias, and people are killing themselves over it,
Right. Over it. Right. Exactly. For all the wrong
basically.
reasons. Yeah, exactly.
So,
I wonder if you could talk at this point about your book, The Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus, which is a lot
yes.
of what we've been trying to, unpack here. And what were your intentions in writing this book? And were you trying to kind of lead people back to the original teachings from all these distortions and misperceptions and misuse?
Well, it was a bit more personal than that even, Carrie, because
Uh,
I've been writing books on this since my first book came out in 1990.
hmm
And so I've been writing books, I've been talking, lecturing, giving workshops, I wrote more books, people had more questions. I wrote a whole book about basically the end times and all this stuff that people
hmm
believe. And so during COVID, I decided, okay, I want to gather everything I've done, or I want to glean from what I've done for the last 40 years and put the best of it all in a book. And
hmm
this was this book, Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus, that came out, I think, in 2022 now. And it has, excuse me for saying, a heck of a lot of Aramaic in it. And the reason I did that, and people say, is this too much Aramaic? So I had to do this because,
Yeah.
everybody's going to come after me if I don't give them word for word how this
Right.
stuff works and, how I got to where I am. Because
hmm
basically, I say, no matter which gospel you look at, if you look at it through an Aramaic lens, and there are Aramaic gospels today, if you
Uh-huh.
look at it through the Aramaic lens, it's all the same Jesus. It's not multiple Jesuses, which
Right.
is again a academic scholarly opinion. You've got the Jesus in Matthew, the Jesus in Luke, the Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas,
hmm
and on and on. It's the
hmm
same Yeshua. He's offering us the same wisdom.
Right.
And so I wanted to show this and also show, you could say, where does Jesus fit in this evolution of human consciousness
hmm hmm hmm
from the more, you could say, selfless, archaic state, as one scholar put it, to where we are today, which is this very selfish, materialized, sort of generally,
hmm
sort of very individualized, isolated,
hmm
and despairing. And these go along with being individualistic and isolationist
hmm hmm
state. And
Right.
how he shows a little bit about how we can get out of this. He
Right.
anticipated it, I feel, 2,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And how we need to
So anyway,
reconnect.
that's why I wrote it. And then because it was so much Aramaic, I did a much simpler book, which is coming out in February,
What is
which is
that book?
It's, this is the way books get titled by publishers now. It's called the
Oh,
Aramaic
right.
Jesus Book of Days. It's
Okay.
all sort of generic. So it's like a
Make it.
thought a day from the Aramaic
Uh,
Jesus. Some of us were
uh-huh.
raised in Christianity with,
Uh-huh.
your Bible thought for the day.
Uh-huh.
Well, I
Got it.
did the same, but I did from Aramaic. So there's
Uh-huh.
less Aramaic, but there's more of me in it, you could say,
Hmm.
and more of what I've gleaned from all this stuff over these years.
I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the notion of embodied spirituality and the importance of it in these Anthropocene times, because there's been, I would say, a lot largely this ability to feel is being suppressed, or some people are very disconnected from that, or they're numbed out, and people have so much screen time that we're not actually out in nature and touching things and feeling things, and the senses are also shamed a lot in at least in Christian theology. There's kind of that notion of the body is a shameful thing, a dirty thing,
Yeah,
or what
exactly.
should be connected
Again,
to.
this was made up too. I mean, I get upset about because Aramaic doesn't have a division between body, mind, soul, and spirit at all. I
Hmm.
mean, Aramaic doesn't even have a word for mind. All it
Hmm.
has is heart. And so
Mm.
our thoughts, our emotions are on the surface of our heart, and our bodies, so to speak, or Yeshua only talks about flesh. Our flesh is supposed to resonate with the rest of nature and with the breath that is beyond the breath and the breath that's in nature. Our flesh, so to speak, is just as spiritual as anything else. So there's no big division between body and spirit. Spirit means the
Right.
breath in Aramaic. Either where you look at nafsha or ruha, they both refer to the breathing. So
Mm-hmm.
the spirit is embodied, and the body, you could say, is in our terms today spiritualized in
Hmm.
the Aramaic. And you can't run a decent empire based on that sort of stuff. Seriously. I mean, Wilhelm Reich said this during Hitler's era, and this is why Reich left Germany in the 30s, because Reich said, two things fascist dictatorships try to do is they try to take people out of their bodies and separate people so they can't meet
Hmm.
and connect with one another.
Sounds like the pandemic.
In some ways, yeah. So, we can look around us and see these things going on. And
You see the parallels because they are there, and I think they're there for us to wake up and reconnect. Yes. I wonder if you could share with us some of the ways, because the depth of what you're learning and your spiritual path and everything that you've sought after for these reasons of understanding yourself, understanding what is your purpose in being here, and how can we contribute to the world in ways that are beneficial. It's not just to ourselves, but to this planet. And I'm wondering if you can share with listeners how they can connect with you, learn more about your books, and if you could share some of the links there. I know you have many videos also online, and
yeah,
your
yeah, I've got this website, as we all do. So it's abwoon.org, abwoon.org. Abwoon is the first word of Yeshua's prayer in Aramaic.
Mhm,
And yes, there are a lot of videos there, a lot of articles, things you can download. All of my books are not just giving information. I've given a lot of information here,
mhm,
but I have contemplations, body prayers,
mhm.
things like that, chants you can do to sort of, in these days, sort of get back more into this consciousness that Yeshua is inviting us to. So, in addition to disabusing people of all these false notions, I try to show after you've done all of that, he's actually showing a way, not the only way, not an
Right.
exclusive
Not
way,
the way,
but he
exactly.
but he is showing a way.
Hmm.
And for many people, it's been very powerful because some of us have an inner feeling for Yeshua
Hmm.
from earliest times. And once we clear all the crap away, excuse me
Hmm.
for saying, then,
Not that.
no, we're free to travel in that way. And then we can
Exactly.
study other
Yeah.
things, Buddhism or Taoism or yoga or all these things. These all open up for us too. We're much more free.
Oh, much more free and open, expansive, ecstatic. It's more like the path of Rumi and like the Sufism that you've practiced for.
Yes.
So listeners definitely do check out Neil's links. And if you do have that calling and feel something, or you have that from your childhood, kind of like I did and ran away from all of that, it's safe to go back to revisit it and learn more what the original teachings were, because it's much more like a direct yogic experience, and that's really what I believe. Yeshua was pointing us toward, and we could use that in our times.
Yeah, as we become more embodied, we make more connections, better connections, more healthy connections, ripe connections with those around us and with nature. I mean, that's it.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you for your life's work, your life's path, and we're truly grateful for you opening this way for other people also to discover in the same way that you did.
Thanks for having me on, Carrie. Good luck to you too.
Thank you.
Hey, listeners, to check out the extended recording of this show or to explore our other shows, visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, and subscribe to our podcast. This has been Eco Justice Radio and our show, Western Culture, Middle Eastern Cosmology, and Reclaiming the Wild Landscape of Spirituality. Thank you to our guest, Neil Douglas-Klotz, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. Please connect with us on social media at Eco Justice Radio, SoCal 350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard and want others to be informed, subscribe and share the episodes. You have been listening to Eco Justice Radio, a project of SoCal 350, executive producer and host, myself, Jack Eit, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.